So we make a start. Welcome everyone. I'm assuming that many of you would be from the Institute itself, and if you are from outside the UCL Institute of Education, welcome. This is an event as part of Education in Conflict and Emergencies seminar series. We've been running these events for the last 6-7 years. It's hosted by the Center for Education and International Development. We also have a network for research in education, conflict and emergencies on Facebook. You're welcome to join if you're interested in what happens in education in conflict-affected contexts, but also how education and conflict interact. My name is Nanjing Massacre. I'm an associate professor here at the Institute, I work on education in conflict-affected contexts. So that's why I convene this seminar series. Today, I'm very delighted to be able to welcome Professor Edward Vickers from Kyushu University in Japan. Ed used to be our colleague here many years ago and went on to become a big professor at Kyushu. He specializes in comparative education particularly, and is recently a UNESCO chair, particularly focusing on education and what's the title?
Education for peace, social justice, and global citizenship.
That's the one, and many congratulations. So that's a new title. So I was not well versed with that. Ed has worked with UNESCO for a number of years, published a lot of works with international organizations, and has recently become has been a co-director of a massive report that UNESCO is publishing as part of the future education. But particularly, Ed has a long sort of experience of working on education in China and in Hong Kong, and particularly in Southeast Asia. So hence the talk today is going to focus on the securitization of education in contemporary China, insights from Hong Kong and beyond. We wanted to invite Ed particularly because we have a lot of students from China, and we teach a course on education, conflict and peace. And often students want to write and talk about conflict in China, which is not an easy topic to discuss, and particularly what is happening in Xinjiang province and the reports that are coming out about human rights violations in that part of China, but also a lot of contestations about to what extent those reports actually depict what is happening inside there, and what to what extent research about those issues is actually possible inside China. And education has become an important part of that process of political socialization, if you like, or however it can be interpreted. But also what has happened in Hong Kong in recent months or in the last couple of years has also hit the headlines of the Western media, and is a very important topic for the UK, but also from education point of view, the way that education is affected when these political tensions happen is quite important to understand how people understand discussions and debates, and how policies and curricula change and so forth, which actually makes absolute sense for us to be able to welcome Professor Steve Tsang from SOAS, who is the director of China Institute in SOAS, is an expert on China issues and has written quite significantly on issues of politics and on China, and also in Hong Kong, has interests on the 20th century Chinese history and Chinese foreign policy, and China's peaceful rise strategy, China's rising military might, and China's soft power, China-UK relations, China-UK-US relations, and etc. And Professor Sang has appeared on a lot of media talking about the politics, geopolitics, and other issues that often hit the headline in the Western media. So it's very interesting, and we are really privileged to be able to welcome Steve to this event today. And the idea is to try and understand politics from Steve's perspectives and education from Ed's perspective, and to see how education is an incredibly important issue when we look into political tensions and conflicts around the world. So the plan today is that Ed will speak for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Steve to make a brief comment on Ed's presentation, as well as more wider issues that may be relevant to the points raised by Ed for about 20 minutes. And then I hope that we'll have some time afterwards, around 25 to 30 minutes time for Q&A. So I'd like to welcome you. The floor is yours, Ed.
Great, thanks very much. Do you want me to put this microphone on?
Yeah, because of...
okay, yeah.
Sorry, I should have told you that the session is being live streamed and is being recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards on the YouTube channel. And we are only capturing the presentation and the discussion of the panelists, but not of the audience. Hope that's okay with everyone. Please do let me know if not.
Okay. Right. Well, thanks very much to Jendra. Yeah, thanks for suggesting this, and thank you very much to Steve for agreeing to be discussant. Steve is, I understand, currently working on a project to do with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping thought. So I imagine he'll have some very interesting sort of things to elaborate on once I've finished my piece. So what I'm going to do in my talk today is to focus primarily on developments in education policy, on the politics of education since the enactment of Hong Kong's national security law in the summer of 2020. And I'm also going to seek to relate developments in Hong Kong to the broader Chinese context, and to some extent to current academic debates on the politics of education globally. But before I get down to that serious stuff, I want to start with a short cartoon feature. So this is a children's book published in Shanghai in 1997 to commemorate Hong Kong's handover to China. And it illustrates, I think, quite crudely, but quite accurately, the standard view of Hong Kong on the Chinese mainland. The title, for those of you who don't read Chinese, is basically Hong Kong's Turbulent Century. And the premise is that this group of jungle animals have decided to get together to put on a play reenacting Hong Kong's colonial history, because that's the sort of thing that jungle animals like to do. So we're expecting this book to tell us about Hong Kong, right? But it doesn't. Rather than telling us about the story of Hong Kong itself, what we have are episodes from China's 19th century conflicts with various foreign powers. So here we have the Japanese dog. There's the Japanese dog in his hachimaki demanding Taiwan, the treaty from Li Hongjiang, the goat, at the Treaty of Shimonoseki, while the pirate snake at the bottom, who represents Britain, is sort of saying, tee hee 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 hee, thank you very much. I will now take the new territories from China to add to my Hong Kong possessions. And then the Chinese people wail in anguish at this humiliating loss, further loss of territory in the top frame here. And then in the bottom frame, cheer in joy, celebrating the 1997 handover of Hong Kong to China. So where is Hong Kong's history in all of this? Well, Hong Kong's history is between these two frames. Yeah, there's nothing about Hong Kong actually in this book. So basically what this book illustrates is that Hong Kong doesn't have a history. It's not entitled to a history from the perspective of mainland China, from the perspective of the Communist Party. Its meaning entirely relates to its association with China's humiliations at the hands of foreign imperialists and China's glorious recovery of Hong Kong, thus expunging those humiliations at the end of the 20th century. And, as we're seeing currently in the Ukraine, denying a society or a community the right to its own past, the right to a history, can be and often is intimately associated with denying that community the right to any autonomous existence at all. So that unambiguous vision of China as an innocent violated by foreign imperialists, which underpins that sort of cartoon account, remains central to mainstream notions of Chineseness on the communist mainland. Scholars researching societies on China's periphery, from Xinjiang or Tibet and Inner Mongolia to Taiwan and Hong Kong, have over recent years increasingly critiqued this narrative of sort of China's unambiguous colonial victimhood. So research on the 18th century wars of conquest that incorporated Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang into the Qing Empire, or on the history of Chinese, as well as Dutch and Japanese colonialism in Taiwan, and on Hong Kong's evolution from conventional colony to a relatively freewheeling city-state, which Steve Dung has written a book about, and then back to a more colonial style of governance under Chinese rule. All of this scholarship in recent years has complicated the picture of China's imperial victimhood. But I think it's fair to say that this complexity, so China's sort of ambiguous relationship with imperialism as victim and perpetrator, has yet to penetrate the mainstream of Chinese studies, where many scholars still exhibit what the Xinjiang scholar David Tobin has called Chinese studies Sinocentric blind spot. In other words, they're not looking at what's happening around the periphery of China and thinking about what that means for China as a whole, what that implies for how we understand China, what China is, what China means. Those seeking to lend nuance to accounts of China's relationship with imperialism often must also confront another form of ideological dogmatism, as strong as anything that the CCP, the Communist Party, has to offer. And that, I think, is the dogma that coloniality and hegemony in our contemporary world are uniquely artifacts of Western modernity. In other words, that the West is colonial and imperialist and everyone else is the victim of that. I'll come back to this in my concluding remarks. That comic book account I just showed you illustrates that the promises regarding Hong Kong's autonomy under the one country, two systems formula never really reflected any recognition of Hong Kong's distinctive history, culture, or identity. For the Communist Party, Hong Kong is simply one place where Chinese people happen to live. It's a place unjustly separated from the motherland in the 19th century, whose people are culturally and ethnically Han, and that's basically all we need to know about them. Because they're Han, they are undifferentiated from their compatriots on the mainland. They are purely and simply Chinese. But until 2019, attempts by Beijing and its local backers in Hong Kong to push mainland-style patriotic education, or national education, as it's usually termed in Hong Kong, attempts to push this were relatively tentative. Like the British administration before 1997, local officials were constrained by their lack of electoral legitimacy. And by the strength of local civil society and a lively culture of protest. So, for example, in 2012, an attempt to impose a compulsory moral and national education subject in local schools was withdrawn in the face of vehement public protests led by a 15-year-old Joshua Wong. So what's changed since 2012? It's tempting to say Xi Jinping. Maybe Steve will have some more to say about this. But the truth, I think, is more complicated. On the one hand, Hong Kong's gradually diminishing economic importance to China has shifted the calculus for Beijing of the costs and benefits of respecting its autonomy. But wider political and ideological shifts on the mainland are also crucial to understanding the crackdown that's happened in Hong Kong. So in mainland schools, for example, we've seen a dramatic rollback, even of the very limited curricular liberalization that happened in the early 2000s in China. So from 2017, the only permitted textbooks for history, Chinese language, or civics, politics, subjects like Dao De Yu, what's it called? Dao De Yu Fazhi or Sixiang Zhengzhi. These compulsory school subjects, all the textbooks for these are published now by the People's Education Press in Beijing. And those textbooks now contain emphatic assertions of Chinese confidence and pride. So emphatic that one's tempted to conclude that the communist leadership is actually very low on confidence, because if you keep having to say, I'm really confident, actually doesn't give a very confident impression. Those who study Xi Jinping's utterances have noted that he seems to be haunted by the collapse and breakup of the Soviet Union, which he attributes to infiltration of Western values and a corruption of the morale of the Soviet Communist Party. And I think it's important to remember that Xi assumed the leadership of China in the aftermath of the Arab Spring and of a domestic power struggle within the Communist Party with Bo Xilai. All of this undoubtedly influenced his handling of challenges such as the cycle of repression and resistance in Xinjiang that Tajendra has mentioned. And that is a situation that Xi Jinping inherited from his predecessors and stems ultimately from an intensification of Chinese settler colonialism in Xinjiang. And there are indications that even before Xi Jinping assumed the leadership, the party was moving towards a far more blatantly assimilationist treatment of ethnic minorities, such as the Uyghurs of Xinjiang. But certainly that assimilationist turn in minorities policy has intensified under Xi Jinping. And that's happened not only in Xinjiang, where the party claims to be facing a terrorist threat from Muslim Uyghurs, but also in regions such as Inner Mongolia, where there's no recent history of unrest. Although there is unrest now because of the educational measures that the party has introduced, including basically a turn away from provision of instruction in the case of Mongolia, in Mongolian towards monolingual Mandarin instruction. So all of that, I think, is relevant. Those are relevant aspects of the broader Chinese context that perhaps to some extent help us to understand the attitudes or assumptions which the central leadership has brought to its handling of unrest in Hong Kong. So returning to Hong Kong, I've already mentioned the successful 2012 protests against the scheme to introduce moral and national education into local schools. This was the campaign in which not only Joshua Wong, but many other leaders of the 2014 umbrella protests or the 2019-2020 protests, all of these young people cut their political teeth in that 2012 protest against moral and national education. That moral and national education subject was intended to balance the earlier introduction of another compulsory school subject called liberal studies. Liberal studies was designed to introduce secondary students to issues in civics and current affairs with an emphasis on inquiry, discussion, and project work. And this is similar to some curricular reforms that we've seen in recent years elsewhere in East Asia, including in mainland China, where inquiry, discussion, project work, analytical skills, creativity, critical thinking, all of this is seen as crucial to success in the global knowledge economy. So it's a sort of what we see in many East Asian societies in recent years is an adoption of if you like, a kind of liberal inquiry-based approach to learning and instruction, but fundamentally for instrumentalist reasons. In other words, if we want to find a Chinese Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, we need this. But as elsewhere in East Asia, what we find is that attempts to gear schooling to the promotion of critical thinking, because they're basically instrumentalist, clash with other quite fundamental aspects of the curriculum, such as a mandate for uncritical patriotic education. So patriotic education comes to be seen as the necessary antidote to any application of critical thinking to political matters. If we're going to teach students to be critical, we have to ensure that there's a sufficient dose of patriotic education in 2019, pro-establishment figures in Hong Kong were therefore primed with a set of arguments blaming popular dissatisfaction on incorrect thinking promoted by bad education. And this is a line, of course, which is far more congenial to local elites and mainland officials than debating many of the protesters' actual grievances, because the desperation, which I think it's fair to say informed demands for democracy in 2014 and again in 2019, arose from a widespread and accurate perception that creeping mainlandization in Hong Kong and declining opportunities for local youth, especially, can ultimately be traced to the Hong Kong government's accountability to Beijing rather than to local people. So when officials in Hong Kong are thinking about who they have to please, who are they thinking of? First and foremost, they're thinking of the guys in Beijing or in the central government liaison office down the road in Hong Kong. They're not really thinking of Grandma Wong in Tsim Sha Tsui or Tuen Mun. As the protests intensified in the summer of 2019, the mainland media launched a concerted attack on liberal studies. Often this involves citing local experts or pro-Beijing media outlets such as the newspaper Wenwei Bao, which were portrayed as representing the views of Hong Kong's silent majority. The People's Daily, Roman Ribao, for example, accused liberal studies of polluting students' minds with poison, fomenting hostility towards the police, promoting Occupy Central, distorting facts, beautifying law-breaking, and generally disseminating political propaganda. Shocking charge coming from a Communist Party newspaper, political propaganda. Particular criticism was directed at the coverage of Hong Kong affairs in the liberal studies subject and the way in which teaching materials explained basic constitutional rights, such as the right to protest. Now, the People's Daily didn't object in principle to the teaching of critical thinking. They made this clear. Critical thinking's okay. But they insisted that if you don't have education in national citizenship, teaching critical thinking is like training students to walk on one leg. 一条腿走路. Yeah. So this illustrates the point I was making about patriotic education as the antidote to critical thinking. Yeah. So if you don't have patriotic education, the students only have one leg. What young Hong Kongers needed was proper understanding of Chinese history and national conditions and firm anchoring in their Chinese coordinates. 中国左表. Yeah, 左表. Yeah, that was a new word for me, coordinates. To prevent them from slipping into a naive embrace of Western standards. So students have to know where they stand. You have to fix them. But in light of what came later, these demands from the People's Daily actually seem relatively moderate, because they basically amounted to demands to extend textbook vetting procedures to liberal studies textbooks which previously hadn't been vetted, like all other textbooks in Hong Kong. So the People's Daily was saying, the government needs to get a grip on the content of the textbooks. They need to revise some of the most contentious content, for example, relating to the right to protest, and there need to be enhancements or adjustments to teacher training to ensure that the teachers are on message. And indeed, by late 2020, textbooks had been revised, and outlets such as the People's Daily declared themselves broadly satisfied with the results. So you might think, that's that. But between late 2019 and late 2020, the whole political and constitutional order in Hong Kong underwent a fundamental transformation. Beijing effectively took direct control of local affairs, and this meant, amongst other things, that they took control of education far more directly than previously appeared to be the case. And we can get a sense of the extent to which the ground has shifted if we look back to April 2020, so almost exactly 2 years ago, when a scandal broke over a question in a history examination set by the Hong Kong Examinations Authority. And this question asked students to discuss the proposition that Japanese influence on China during the early 20th century was more beneficial than harmful. Yeah, discuss. Now, if you want to promote critical reflection on a historical matter, that's actually a very good question. There's a lot to say about that. But when pro-Beijing media got hold of this exam paper, there was a chorus of patriotic outrage, and the Hong Kong Education Secretary cancelled that question retrospectively. So the students had already sat in their examination halls, sweating away, feverishly trying to, come up with intelligent answers to this question. And then the Education Secretary cancelled it, said those answers cannot be marked. This question is outrageous. We must pretend it never existed. Now, the point is that in April 2020, that sort of official interference in education was a major scandal. So The Economist ran an article on it. This is less than 2 years ago. Today, official control over education and the media basically make it unthinkable that any question like that would ever make it into an exam paper or a textbook or indeed a classroom. Because if a teacher was to raise that question in a classroom in Hong Kong today, they would risk losing their job or even going to prison. And that's because the key change that's overtaken Hong Kong since that time is and which has set the seal on direct rule from Beijing over education and other matters, is the June 2020 imposition of a national security law, which seems to have happened over the heads of local officials and without any meaningful consultation. So it doesn't seem that local officials had much warning that this was coming. And this law has handed various draconian powers to government to constrain civil society. Although initially, when it was announced 2 years ago, it was unclear how those powers would actually be used. The law also explicitly mandated, and this is very similar to what had previously happened in Xinjiang, the law mandated the introduction of national security education. So along with the national security law comes national security education. This is seen as a component of this legislative innovation. I think it's fair to say that the implications of the national security law have been even more severe than many more pessimistic observers initially feared. So Hong Kong's lively civil society is effectively being crushed. The owner of what was 2 years ago Hong Kong's most popular newspaper, Jimmy Lai, is now in jail, along with scores of other pro-democracy activists and politicians. Almost every media outlet critical of the government has gone. Organizations monitoring local civil liberties have shut up shop, often to protect their own staff from possible prosecution. As I had mentioned, school teachers have been sacked for supposedly infringing the new law by discussing controversial matters with their students. And the professional body that would previously have sought to protect those teachers, the Hong Kong Professional Teachers Union, has also gone. And in case any teachers are still insufficiently cowed and subservient, leading pro-Beijing figures such as the previous chief executive, C.Y. Leung, that's him, have sought to rally the public to report on teachers they suspect of contravening the national security law. Meanwhile, the government has introduced a new subject, citizenship and social development, that delivers a pared-down version of the liberal studies curriculum that's consistent with patriotic political correctness. As required under the national security law, it has also introduced guidelines for national security education for implementation at every level of the education system from kindergarten upwards. So we need patriotic 5-year-olds. This emphasizes, the content of national security education emphasizes correct interpretation of the one country, two systems principle, making clear the absolute supremacy of one country and the imperative of loyalty to the central government in Beijing over everything else. National security education is a cross-curricular theme, which means that its principles are supposed to inform the teaching of every school subject. So every teacher of every subject is supposed to incorporate these themes in their teaching. Now, in the past, there have been a number of such cross-curricular themes, notably civic education. It was first introduced in the 1980s. And generally, what has happened with these is that teachers and schools have just ignored them. But this case is different because implementation of national security education is being strongly policed and monitored. And the Education Bureau itself has prepared a lot of relevant teaching materials for use in schools. So more is required of schools and teachers than just sort of passively accepting these materials or receiving them, filing them in the library and forgetting about them. Because there's also a performative element to national security education. For example, at regular flag-raising ceremonies in schools and on occasions such as National Security Education Day, every April from last year, students, teachers, and the general public are expected to perform patriotic rituals. Yeah, so you can't just, passively accept this. You have to get out there and perform it. Here's a graphic encouraging people to learn about national security. I think this was produced by the government, National Security Education Day last year. One thing I think it's interesting to note about this sort of graphic is its implicitly infantilizing portrayal of citizenship. So the state is the daddy. I think the daddy rather than the mummy in this case. The daddy, and you, the citizens, are the cute and obedient children. Now this performative element of national security education or national security education in general applies not least to university students who, of course, have been branded as the chief culprits of the unrest in 2019 and 2020. Over the past year, students' unions in every local university have been disbanded, and student representation in university governing bodies has been removed. Education in national security is now compulsory for university students across Hong Kong, just as politics classes or Marxism classes are for students in mainland China. At Baptist University, they use cartoon characters called Mr. Naughty and Ms. Breach as sort of teaching aids for national security education, again illustrating the infantilizing assumptions underpinning national security education. Amongst the paraphernalia of patriotic education that's been newly imported from the mainland is the compulsory commemoration in Hong Kong schools of the event that's often been branded as China's Holocaust, in other words, the Nanjing Massacre of 1937. Last December, when schools marked this event for the first time, Nanjing Massacre Memorial Day, they were supplied by the Education Bureau with teaching materials, including a graphic 5-minute video extract from a documentary showing archive footage of the atrocities in Nanjing. So Japanese soldiers going around chopping people's heads off or throwing bodies into mass graves. In at least one primary school, this video was shown to 6-year-olds, leaving them traumatized and prompting complaints from their parents. The government's response was that teachers should use their professional judgment in deciding how to teach this topic in an age-appropriate way. So the government now invokes teachers' autonomous professional judgment, having spent 2 years completely destroying teachers' confidence in their own autonomy. Meanwhile, an Education Bureau spokesman unapologetically opined that history is history. So what lessons should we derive from all this? Well, one, I think, concerns the importance of bringing peripheral, marginalized populations to the center of our consciousness. Well, there's a platitude I think we can all sign up to. But when it comes to China, that means when we look at China, we don't simply assume that China is a monolithic culture or society, that we think about what light Hong Kong experience or Xinjiang experience or Taiwanese experience or Shanghainese experience can shed on China. Now, another level of this relates to the status of Europe or Eurocentrism in Western scholarship. And the provincialization of European or Western experiences is loudly demanded these days by advocates of decolonization. And, rightly so in many ways. There's still insufficient awareness of Chinese experience in Western academia, I think it's fair to say. Chinese voices are often not included or not heard in Western debates. But as I've just said, what do we mean when we talk about Chinese experience? Who is entitled to speak for China? Too often, the assumption of Chinese subalternity in a supposedly Western-dominated world ends up persuading institutions such as this to lend a platform to state-backed actors claiming to speak for a monolithic China. Ignorance of the diversity of China and the suppression of that diversity by the state often leads to uncritical acceptance in Western academia, in Western institutions, in the media, uncritical acceptance of this myth of China, China's homogeneity and unambiguous imperial victimhood. Lazy generalizations about Chinese culture, invoking Confucius and company, help to legitimate a totalitarian regime that is increasingly appealing to a monolithic and highly conservative vision of Han Chinese tradition. So as I just said, if we accept that Hong Kong and Taiwan, or Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, let alone Tibet and Xinjiang are actually all parts of China, then we need to recognize that Chineseness is something far more fluid and diverse than the Communist Party would have us believe. But if a Eurocentric focus on the evils of Western hegemony leads us to ignore or downplay oppression in non-Western societies, then we're distorting history and giving a gift to propagandists in Beijing and elsewhere. And I say that because I think this is has recently been a powerful trend, certainly in educational scholarship or in comparative education. So finally, calls for the decolonization of scholarship, which we hear or have heard very much in recent years, should be taken seriously. But an excessively dogmatic or monomaniacal pursuit of decolonization can blind us to the complexity and nuance of non-Western experience. At its worst, it can encourage a narcissistic focus on our, and I speak as a Westerner, on our supposedly unique inheritance of sinfulness, as if no one but we Westerners were ever capable of the evils of imperialism. But if we truly want to counter Eurocentrism, then challenging Eurocentric interpretations of imperialism is a good place to start. Failing to do so, I think, is a betrayal of those in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and elsewhere who find themselves confronted today with the very palpable reality of what I think it's fair to describe as Chinese imperialism. Okay.
Thanks, Ed. That was, super, really thought-provoking. I think, particularly the concluding remark, makes us really think about these issues. So, without further ado, can I invite Steve to make a remark? Would you like
should I?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Right. I can see that quite a few of you may have a Hong Kong connection. So I would very much like to encourage you to speak up, because so much that we're talking about today is about you. And your voice matters more than the voice of the distinguished Professor Vickers or I. I came in with a pile of paper, blank papers. So what I'm going to say are based on what I've heard from what Ed has said. And I think he has said a lot of very interesting and important things. I want to start off with what he said about education in And well, I'll start off with the changes that he underlined with the National Security Law of 2020. And then I'll come back to the wider question of education and how we can take not just a Hong Kong perspective and a wider Chinese perspective to the issue. Now, I think Ed is completely right to underline the importance of the National Security Law, how much it has changed everything. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that, well, I won't even call it a national security law. That's what they call it. It's not a national security law. It's a state security law. The Chinese character may be the same, but in the English language, it means something very different. When we talk about national security in English, we have a normal understanding of the term. There is a threat to the nation. There's a national security, an external threat that can challenge the integrity of that state, of that nationhood. What national security challenge are we talking about in Hong Kong? What happened in 2019? What did you and your friends do? How did you, a whole lot of students, I don't know whether you were undergraduates in 2019 or whether you were high school students in 2019, but what did you do that you could potentially challenge the national security of the second most powerful country on earth? Nothing. You did nothing. You were trying to assert your rights that were promised, in your view, to you by the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Hong Kong Basic Law and the Chinese Constitution. But you pose a threat to the authority of the Communist Party of China, to the Chinese state, to the authority of China's supreme leader. That you pose a state security threat. When we talk about state security threat, we are often talking about regime security. Well, even there, the threat you pose in Hong Kong, thousands of miles away from Beijing, was very small. But you were dealing with a leader who said when he became leader of China in 2012, that the collapse of communism in in the world, starting in the Berlin Wall and then in the Soviet Union, was because within the CPSU there was a traitor like Gorbachev who attempted unthinkable things, really. And within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, comrades were not man enough to stand up to the traitor, and the rest is history. This ain't going to happen in China under my watch. You got it? This is what you're dealing with. So the very beginning of posing of any basic challenge, any part in China is not acceptable. Yes, that's a big deal. And all those changes that Ed has elaborated, I think, are entirely important and real, and we need to recognize. But do you then blame yourself for what you did in 2019? If you didn't do it in 2019, there would not be the 2020 National Security Law. Hong Kong might be asked, as is required under Article 23 of the Hong Kong Basic Law, that you should introduce some kind of a national security legislation in Hong Kong. That's constitutional. That is part of your basic law. But that's very different from the national security law that you in the end got. Having said all that, I would then want you to look at something else. And this is something which I think is very, very important for people in Hong Kong to realize. If you want to have a future in Hong Kong that is closer to what you would like, don't focus on Hong Kong's politics, Hong Kong's history, and your things. look at China's politics, that's what really shapes you. 2017 was the really crucial year. 2017 was the year when Xi Jinping embraced the idea called the Greater Bay Area that Hong Kong was asked to adopt. When it was being announced, when the enormous bridge from Hong Kong to China was to be built, most of people in Hong Kong just thought, okay, this is just another of those white elephant projects that Beijing wants, that Hong Kong doesn't want. We don't really need it, we don't want it, but we can afford it. We buy them off, we build it. What's the big deal? Let's move on. Focus on today as Hong Kong, what we want. What you didn't realize was the concept behind the Greater Bay Area. The bridge doesn't matter. But the concept of the Greater Bay Area is fundamental. That's a paradigm shift. Before the Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong as a special administrative region was special, as a special administrative region in its own right. With the Greater Bay Area concept, Hong Kong is to be a very important part of the Greater Bay Area, of which the center is Shenzhen, not Hong Kong. You are being integrated into part of a much bigger regional part of China. The specialness of Hong Kong, the one country, two systems, the high degree of autonomy that you had been allowed, and in fact continue to be allowed to entertain two different interpretations. Your interpretation of those promises and Beijing's interpretation of those promises. Until the protests of 2019, which Beijing saw as an open rebellion and must therefore be suppressed, and therefore had to introduce the draconian measures of the state security law to deal with it. That changed. Now, if you had known, you could have planned better for it. You could have adjusted. When you cannot take on a superior force, you use not frontal attack. You use guerrilla warfare. You use other means to engage. You essentially will be fighting a rearguard operations. Why go on a frontal attack when your objective is a rearguard operation? That's so much for 2019 and 2020. I'm mindful that being a bit indulgent with myself, and there are other very important things that Ed has highlighted, and I wanted to take a few minutes just to talk about this education thing. In terms of that education, in terms of the very important point Ed made about Hong Kong's critical thinking and China's patriotic education and how should one call it? Patriotic critical thinking? Just one single word of difference, and they mean exactly the opposite thing. The critical thinking that you are used to, that you inherited from the British colonial education, was to encourage you to ask questions. You might not get the answer, but you could ask questions, you could embarrass, including at yourself. But patriotic critical thinking means that, yes, you can be critical as much as you like, provided your critical thinking is within the correct patriotic framework. You don't ask the wrong questions. You only ask the right questions. Who judge what is right or wrong? Not you. There is somebody there who will tell you what is right, what is wrong. The cartoons that Ed shows you from the beginning is absolutely fantastic. What I want to say here next is that if you think this was about Hong Kong, think again. What Xi Jinping is trying to create in China is one single united patriotic Chinese people. Doesn't matter whether you're Han, like Hong Kong people, or you're Uyghurs, or you're Tibetans. If you all learned to love the Communist Party, appreciate what the Communist Party has done for you, you are nothing without the Communist Party. You appreciate that, you know that, you respect that. And you know at the top of the Communist Party, leading it to the rightful path, to great glory of the Chinese people is Xi Jinping. You love all that. That's fine. You can love Hong Kong too. You can love Taylor Swift. That doesn't matter. You can even love Buddhism. That's okay too. But you have to love the party, respect the party's version, which, by the way, is the only version of history that is correct. Every single other version of history is not correct. And this is the education agenda that is being pushed forward. And that is the problem that people in Hong Kong are facing. And how do you deal with that? I don't think there's a simple answer. I don't think there's a right answer or a wrong answer to it. Each Hong Kong person will have to think about it oneself and come up with the answer oneself and put that answer to one's next generation. Because the new patriotic education is to be implemented in Hong Kong from kindergarten onwards, all the way up. And from this point onward, there is no turning back. Not unless there is a big change in China. I think I probably have taken up too much time, so I will stop here so that there's a bit more time for question and answers.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks very much. Yeah, maybe you can have it. Ed can have it. I think.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve and Ed. I think that was quite fascinating to hear both of you. I'm just thinking about this idea of patriotism and critical thinking. These are quite interesting concepts. But I think history is always sort of controlled by the authority, no matter which country you go to. I think at least they try to control as much as possible. At the first instance, you might sometimes ask, what's wrong about being patriotic to your country, right? I think a lot of people would, common citizens would actually think that, okay, I love my country, and what's wrong about that? And I think that that's the question that you would often grapple with when you interact with, especially young generation that has been taught in that patriotic education framework. And how do you break that sort of very naive position of individuals who actually don't see the problem with patriotic education? I think these are some of the points that you pointed, you mentioned were quite powerful in the way that it's not just the policies and how education is performed, but also very deep level educational processes. That performativity of education is in operation in producing a loyal citizenry that would not challenge the control of Beijing. So I think this is time for us probably to make some remarks or ask questions to the speakers. So I would like to open the floor for any questions or any thoughts.
Yeah, I have a question for both professors. Thank you so much for sharing. It's really insightful. I just want to ask, why would China choose education as its weapon of choice, for assimilation, as what the first professor was saying? And is there any special context to the Chinese history or Chinese politics that make them use education as an arsenal for assimilation?
It's a brilliant question.
I can get started first.
Yeah, sure.
If you want. The Communist Party of China has a monopoly of the truth. And they know how very important it is. As an aside, in some ways, the most insightful work that you can find to understand how that system works is George Orwell. Read 1984, and you can see exactly why the Chinese government behaves the way it does, and how education is being seen as so important. The mind of the people is what they want to control. And what best than education as a means to shape people's mind? You catch them from a very young age. You shape them for the rest of your life. And one of the interesting things Orwell has explained, not perhaps in 1984, but in some of his many other works, was an experimental idea that you can ask people what 2 plus 2 is. And if you, before asking that question, have keep on repeating that 2 plus 2 is 5, you can actually have some people who will answer that 2 plus 2 is 5. As simple as that. That is how powerful it can be.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe you were kind of angling for the answer that, or suggesting in your question that there's something in Chinese culture or tradition that sort of programs the Chinese government to, reach for education, as part of its toolkit for dealing with protest. But I think, as Steve has indicated in his answer, it's not just the Chinese that do this. I mean, George Orwell's 1984 is not meant to be about China. Communist regimes and authoritarian regimes and other kinds of regimes have sought to use education to shape a modern citizenry and to ensure its loyalty. If you wanted to look for sort of resources or precedents in the Chinese past for the use of education, you could, point to Confucian ideas of statecraft. You could, the notion of, jiaohua, transformation of the people through education. But I'm reluctant to rely too much on these sorts of interpretations or explanations that constantly relate everything back sort of primarily or purely to Chinese tradition. Because as Steve has indicated, it's not just in China that these things happen.
Thanks. Yeah, Mao?
Thank you very much. I have a question. So regarding national security education, I think the education is not only done in the school, but the family has much more impact on the education of the children, like when they grow. So if the parents have different education, for example, before the national security education, they have kind of level education before. So is there any contestation between the education in the school and also the education in the family, and how does the impact for the children can be in terms of that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think often people think about schools when we discuss education, but a lot of learning and political socialization happens outside the very controlled formal education systems. What is the power of that kind of non-formal or informal education?
Shall I go first this time, maybe? So, yeah, that's an interesting question. And I say two things. I mean, I mentioned this, what we've seen recently in Hong Kong, encouraging students, parents, other teachers to report on what's said in schools. I mean, the national security law or state security law is a blanket sort of instrument. It doesn't just apply to what goes on in schools. It applies to what's said or written everywhere, including potentially, in the home. I mean, I haven't seen any reports of this actually happening, but if a child was to sort of speak up in class and say, "Oh, what about this?" or I've heard that some people argue that Hong Kong should be independent. What would that lead to in Hong Kong today? I mean, in many totalitarian societies, and certainly to some extent in mainland China, people are careful about what they say to their children because they don't want that repeated, outside the home innocently by their children. And another thing I would say is that you'll be aware that there are a large number of Hong Kongers in Britain now who've come basically, in the last 2 years as a result of the repression in Hong Kong. And if you talk to a lot of these people who are here from Hong Kong, especially those who have children, they will very often say, why have I come? Because I want to get my kids out of that system of education. I want to basically rescue them from this incredibly sort of oppressive, brainwashing education. Not just that, though. There's also the intensely competitive ethos of Hong Kong education, which is also very sort of dehumanizing, which we find in cities across China. But this being so novel in Hong Kong, I think a lot of parents are shocked by the implications of this for their children, and that's been one factor causing many to look to get out.
I'll just add that if you go to China and get to know people under the age of 40 who have never left China, they don't know. Overwhelming majority of them do not know what happened on the 4th of June, 1989. They really don't know. Your iconic image of the Tank Man is something that younger Chinese below the age of 40 often cannot make sense of. What on earth was that? Why? Because parents in China who lived through 1989 wanted to protect them. And it's safer not to tell them what happened around Tiananmen Square in Beijing on the night of the 3rd and the morning of the 4th of June, 1989. If they knew, and if they stood up and tried to do something about it, what will happen to them? That's why I said there's no good answers, right answers. It's up to individuals to decide what they want to tell their children. Either is the right course. Neither is the wrong course. It's a human reaction. Do you want to tell your children the truth, the values, the right, encourage them to stand up and be cut down? Or do you encourage them or protect them from that and let them have an uneventful and potentially otherwise rewarding life? I don't think we should judge people whichever they choose.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think mine is a short one on I heard both presenters talk about securitization, but the other talks about the state's securitization and the other talks about national securitization of education. So I think I wanted to get a line between, but my question is on the possibility of, the world today, especially in the context of China, living within its limit while accepting that, yeah, we are Chinese, but that's a sovereign state, but they are able to speak Chinese with their own identities. Is that a possibility?
I mean, this relates to this idea of when does, patriotic loyalty to your history and culture becomes problematic, and also, unless you believe in, unless you see the other as problematic, I mean, is it not okay to have your own culture celebrated and learn about it, as long as you don't exploit or oppress the other? But also, how does that securitization narrative operates?
Well, I mean, Steve's already indicated what we're talking about here is the state rather than the nation, and you know, patriotism as defined by the Communist Party doesn't just mean loyalty to the nation; it means loyalty to the state. You know, why should we be loyal to a particular political party or to a particular, you know, ideology? I mean, but if we interpret patriotism as loyalty to a nation, that's also, of course, potentially problematic. There's an interesting essay by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre on I think it's called "Is Patriotism a Virtue?" And basically, he doesn't answer the question because he concludes that it's very difficult to answer because to some extent there is a trade-off. You know, being patriotic means prioritizing your loyalty to this group of people over your loyalty to humanity as a whole. And so to the extent, you know, to some extent, the more patriotic you are, maybe, you know, the less inclined you are to sort of recognize the equal claims to regard or rights or respect or whatever of those who do not belong to your community or your nation. On the other hand, we don't live as simply as members of humanity. We live as citizens, you know, everywhere in the modern world. We live as citizens of states. In reality, we do have, you know, our rights and obligations are embedded in social networks, are embedded in political institutions. And if we don't have a sense of loyalty to place or community, then the coherence of that society, the sustainability of those institutions can suffer. And I think we see this in East Asia, for example, if we compare, say, the Philippines on the one hand to somewhere like Japan or South Korea on the other. And I speak as someone who lives in Japan most of the time. You know, in a sense, those are sort of two extremes, with apologies to any Japanese or Filipinos. But I mean, the Philippines is an extremely unequal society, an extremely divided society, one in which elites often identify more with America or with connections outside the Philippines than they do with, you know, the poor people who live in the slums 5 minutes down the road or right outside their gates. The Philippines is a society that's not characterized by strong patriotism in general. It's a very divided, very sort of vociferous society. Japan, on the other hand, is characterized by extremely strong identification with Japan, and very strong sense that, you know, we are all basically, we share an identity, we share values, we share pretty much everything. We are all the same, and, you know, we belong together. But then what that does is it excludes, quite kind of starkly excludes those who do not share that identity. And so, yeah, it's a difficult one. Is patriotism a virtue? Yes and no.
Can I just add very briefly? It's very easy for once to say that there really can't be any real serious exceptions to patriotism. I mean, loving one's country, what's wrong with that? The issue here is it an open one or is it a closed circuit one? If there's one thing we have learned from human history, is that we get it wrong all the time. Some of our society, some of our governments acknowledge the historical wrongs we have made. Perhaps thousands of years late, we acknowledge we were wrong. My predecessor government was wrong to have done this. And we must be aware that all the beliefs we have held sincerely, that this particular idea of loving this particular country can actually be misguided. If we provide scope for that orthodoxy that the state introduced being challenged openly without undue consequences, I don't see a huge problem with that. You can contest, you can debate, there's no problem. When you cannot debate, when you cannot contest, when you have to embrace the one and only true version of history and narrative of you as what you are, and you cannot feel what you are, you must be what I say you are, then I've got a problem with that.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for your perspective on the national security.
Could you speak a bit louder? Yeah.
Okay. So your presentation and discussion really make me want to rethinking what really defines the nation, what really defines the national identity and the patriotism. And then if we can see the Chinese law for education is a political party-led one or the Han affinity-led education towards patriotism, like is it possible to compare it to like in Pakistan or in India, it's more a religion that's a Muslim religion in Pakistan education, and Hindu religion in the India led education towards patriotism. So how do you see this? How do you see the common points between these different curriculum frameworks, or the differences between them, like how they diminish the diversity within the society, or how they how they have to build their so-called nationality or patriotism that the government wants to do.
Yeah, thank you. Or even America first, or Britain as a unique nation, a different.
Yes, the Gove view.
Yes.
I mean, we can look at many countries. I mean, you mentioned Pakistan and, well, India, certainly under the BJP. We can think of many examples of countries where the government effectively wants to say there is only one way of being a patriotic citizen, and it's this way. It's the way we tell you. And as I think we've discussed the problems with that. But another thing to say about patriotism, about identity, about loyalty, is that none of us has simply one level of identity. Yeah. When I was a teenager, I was a bit of a sort of strange teenager, maybe. I had a sticker on the door of my bedroom that said, "My country, Europe." Yeah. I mean, it's a bit odd because Europe's never been a country. It's not a country. But I mean, I stuck it there because I felt European. I mean, when I was small, I grew up in Germany. I am European. But we have a government here in Britain at the moment that, wants to tell us that we can't be European and British. Or at least not if European means belonging to the EU, or not if it means a sort of nested sovereignty, and what goes along with that is a sort of nested identities. But I think all of us have nested identities, like a Russian doll. Sorry, maybe am I allowed to mention Russian dolls? Or yeah, okay, but all of us have that. So it should be possible to be a proud Hong Konger, loyal to Hong Kong, proud of what you think or feel makes Hong Kong distinctive, and a proud Chinese citizen. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to draw a sort of hard and fast divide between Hong Kong and China any more than I would between Scotland and Britain. Yeah, I mean, these identities should not be, we should not, I think, you know, I don't think it's healthy to think of identities as mutually exclusive. But there are many forces, including actually Scottish nationalists, who want us to think of identity in that way. I just don't think it's healthy in today's world.
I'm just conscious of time, that we got about 5 minutes. We can probably take maybe one more question, or maybe two questions, if that's okay, at the same time, and then maybe the presenters could respond together. So one question here, and anyone else? Oh, you wanted to ask Chris? Okay, so you go first, and then you.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you, Professor, for this very, very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And I have this question, maybe because I'm not so familiar with the context of Hong Kong.
Can you speak up again?
Okay, sorry. Now it's better?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, go on.
Because I remember Professor Vickers mentioned actually in another lecture that Kuomintang has done pretty much the same thing in Taiwan in the 1990s, the patriotic education. But the Taiwanese, they don't buy it because they don't see what's written in the books or in their real life. So I'm wondering, what do you think this will happen? What will be the influence of this patriotic education on the real influence on Hong Kongers? Because will they buy it? And also, I wonder, because Professor Sun just mentioned about the 1989. Actually, my mom has a friend whose father is an officer in army, so she don't believe there is actually such a movement. She absolutely don't believe this. So I wonder, what do you think? What makes patriotic education so successful in mainland China? I always have this kind of wondering why it's so different in China, mainland China, and Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Yeah, but also at the same time, is patriotic education, if it was being delivered in Hong Kong and in Taiwan to protect those unique identities of city-states, is that acceptable? Because they're small and, just made me think about that. Okay, the other question there?
So I think in earlier years, Hong Kong people are more like relatively patriotic compared to now. Because, for example, when it was in 2008, when there was the Olympic Games in Beijing, like Hong Kong people would also like kind of support the Chinese team and Hong Kong team at the same time. And during the Sichuan earthquake, like Hong Kong people kind of made the highest number of donations to the Chinese people as well. So and there was some statistics showing that at that time, Hong Kong people feel like they are Hong Kong people, but also Chinese at the same time. However, I think that it's changed a lot, especially after 2014, the umbrella movement. So at that time, the statistics showing that Hong Kong people would just think that they are Hong Kong people instead of Chinese. So I wonder, what do you think is the major reason for this huge change in attitude? Is it because of the accumulating influence from the Chinese government, or is it because of particular event like the introduction of moral and national education in 2012? And then, or is it because of the liberal education which makes Hong Kong people think more critically? What do you think is the major reason for that change?
Great. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, Steve first.
Okay. I think the two questions in some ways really comes together, because we're contrasting the effectiveness of the patriotic education type of state education thought control in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. The one difference is that China has a proper Leninist system that at one stage was genuinely totalitarian, and is getting increasingly more totalitarian in the last 10 years. And that's very, very different from what you have in Hong Kong at the moment. And in the worst of the Kuomintang repressions in Taiwan, the Kuomintang was never a Leninist system. It never had the effectiveness and control and the willingness and capacity to inflict pain that a Leninist system is capable of and is known to be capable of. And that capacity and the credibility of that threat was the reason why when communism collapsed in Eastern Europe with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then Eastern Europe, and then in the Soviet Union, there was not one single squeak anywhere in China. Because people knew if they attempted a Eastern European style or Soviet Union protest, that will be the end of the first 100,000 people who rise up. Or whatever the figure may happen to be. You don't know. Would you like to be the first 100,000, or you wait until you become the 100,001? As to your Hong Kong questions of why things have changed, I think a lot of it is in the literature on nationalism. It is the heroic us versus the evil them. It's the dynamics of it. If Beijing had been more relaxed about Hong Kong, there would not have been that pushback and reaction. Your Hong Kong identity came up. At the end of the British colonial era, when people could then go to China and interact with people from the mainland of China and realize that, oh, okay, actually we thought we are Chinese, but we are not that Chinese. We're a different kind of Chinese. We are Hong Kong Chinese. And then they embraced the handover. I mean, the handover was an amazing time. People in Hong Kong at the same time goes to commemorate the colonial legacy, taking whole families to take pictures of colonial emblems that they had no feeling about for 153 years. And then suddenly they took them. And at the same time, celebrated when the PLA crossed the border. There wasn't a contradiction in their mind. They could embrace that. But slowly and slowly, when you suddenly realize that they come in and they are different, they try to change you, they want you to think like them, you react, you counteract, you become more a new kind of strengthened, reinforced, new Hong Kong identity. I think that's basically where it is. I don't know what Ed thinks.
Yeah, I basically agree. But I think yes, as Taiwan under the Kuomintang, under martial law, was in some ways superficially a Leninist society. I mean, the Kuomintang, in some ways, modeled itself on the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and wanted to establish or run a one-party state, but it never did it particularly thoroughly, and never with the same sort of systematic violence as a serious Leninist party would have done. I think the point that I was making in that other lecture and that you're alluding to is what is it that makes patriotic education effective? And certainly, as Steve was suggesting, in mainland China, one key element is fear, which suppresses conversations that might challenge the messages that patriotic education is transmitting in schools or anywhere else. But at the same time, for patriotic education to resonate with people, it has to somehow reflect or speak to their lived experience. And I think a lot of the messages that patriotic education in mainland China seeks to emphasize, to do with Chinese pride, to do with the humiliation that China has experienced and the problems that this has created for modern China. If you haven't got much experience of the rest of the world, or if there's nothing in your own experience to challenge those messages, it can seem very appealing. I think it can seem, I think Many people have written about the appeal of nationalism, the appeal of belonging. If there's nothing that challenges those messages in your own experience or in your own, exposure to the media or whatever, you may feel very inclined to identify with that narrative. But in Taiwan under the Kuomintang, you have a party, you have a government saying, you are Chinese, Taiwan is nothing, we are the government of the whole of China, including Outer Mongolia. And by the 1980s, clearly, that, I think, just seemed, or even earlier than the 1980s, just seemed increasingly ridiculous to most Taiwanese. This is just a fiction everybody pretends to believe in, but it doesn't sort of reflect reality in Taiwan. In the case of Hong Kong, well, it's very difficult to predict what the effects of national education or state education will be, or national security education will be in 10 years, 20 years' time. Will we reach a situation as we have in China now where a future generation of Hong Kongers knows nothing about the protest movement of 2019, 2020? What protest movement? Did that ever happen? I suspect we won't reach that situation in Hong Kong, but it's hard to say. I mean, things could change even more than they have. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think I'm very conscious of the time because Steve also needs to go and we need to finish. I was also thinking about this narrative of victimhood when you were talking about the history text depicting the Nanjing Massacre that every child needed to study, and the video clip that they needed to be taught in school. Whether the narratives of victimhood contributes to hardening of nationalism in the same way that maybe fear could also.
Well, I think there's one more thing to say about Hong Kong, which we haven't mentioned, which is, what is Hong Kong's origins? What is Hong Kong society? It's a refugee society. If you go back, 2-3 generations, what were Hong Kong people or their grandparents refugees from? Essentially refugees from the Communist Party. And, given that's what Hong Kong is, how is Communist Party centered, communist state centered patriotic education, really going to speak to a population like that? Is it going to be able to sort of fundamentally transform folk memory? Because I think to the extent that patriotic education has been successful in mainland China, it's succeeded, by emphasizing messages like the memory of the Nanjing Massacre or the invasion of Japan, by sort of going with the grain of folk memory. Patriotic, to succeed, it has to sort of, resonate with people's, the stories that families tell. And I don't think that's going to happen in Hong Kong. I can't see it happen.
Can I just add one short sentence? I really do need to go. The Nanjing Massacre narrative is based on lies. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. The lie is that when it happened, when it was reported to Yan'an, what do you think Chairman Mao said? Jolly good.
Yes.
Save us from killing them.
Yes.
Anyway, so that's a painful thing to hear, but hopefully there would be some collective initiatives around history. I mean, some initiatives have taken place, I think, through researchers around rewriting that difficult historical past. But anyway, so we have run out of time, and I would like to thank Professor Edward Vickers and Professor Steve Tsang for this wonderful seminar today, and we really, really appreciate. And can we give them a round of applause? And thank you, everyone, for joining the seminar today, and hopefully we'll see you again in the next seminar soon. Thank you.